What does it mean to be happy, and how do we become happier? Well, we're here at UC Riverside at the psychology department to speak with Dr. Sonja Lyubormirksy, who is a world-renowned expert on the topic. And today we're going to have a very informal conversation around her research, trying to figure out the barriers that get in the way from allowing us to be happier, and discussing some strategies, some proven strategies, that will facilitate our goals of becoming happier, more fulfilled individuals.
So my name is Sonja Lyubormirksy, and I was trained as an experimental social psychologist at Stanford, and I've been doing research on happiness for 30 years. And actually, the way I started doing research is, the very first day of grad school, my advisor was Lee Ross, who's one of the world's experts on conflict and negotiation. And I still remember we kind of took a walk around campus. We went to the Rodin Sculpture Garden. I remember him telling me about how a great experiment is like a great sculpture, and like kind of like or a great finding, a great study, that because the more, every time you look at it, you might see something new in it, or you learn something different from it. Anyway, so we sort of start talking, and I don't know who said it first, and it was probably him. He said, what is happiness? And, why are some people happier than others? And what's the secret to happiness? So that's kind of how it all started. In the first about 10 years of my career, I was mostly comparing happy and unhappy people, just kind of to try to understand, like, what is it about them? Like, in jargon terms, kind of what are the cognitive, motivational, affective processes that distinguish them? How do they think and behave differently? And then reporters, journalists would often contact me, and they would ask me about a finding. So, for example, for my dissertation in grad school, it was basically about social comparison. And I found that people who are happier are, well, I would say, are less likely to compare themselves to others, although that's not exactly true, because we all compare, we just can't help it, but happier people just don't let social comparisons affect them as much. Of course, we see other people are more attractive than us or make more money, but happier people just don't let that affect their mood and their self-esteem. And so journalists would ask me, well, so should we tell our readers or our viewers that they should compare themselves less to others? And I thought, well, it's an interesting question, but first I felt it was a really applied question, and I saw myself as a basic scientist. And also said, well, I don't know the answer to that question because it's a correlation, right? Just because happier people do something doesn't mean that if you're unhappy and you do it, you're going to become happier. And then it kind of hit me one day, well, of course, first of all, it's a very interesting basic science question, how happiness can shift over time, how and why can that happen? And that we can do experiments to find out. So we can do randomized controlled trials, kind of like clinical trials. I call them happiness interventions, where we, prompt or encourage some people to behave in one way. We have a comparison group, control groups to do something else, and then we follow them across time to see if they get happier, if they feel more connected, if they get healthier. So that's what I've basically been doing the last 30 years. Well, lots of people have different definitions of happiness, and we actually have a project with a philosopher where we're studying kind of philosophical definitions of happiness and kind of trying to translate that into psychology. But I like to use Ed Diener. Ed Diener is kind of the founder of the field of happiness. The definition that I think most research psychologists use, and that is that happiness really has two components. And the first component is the experience of positive emotions. So sort of on a fairly frequent basis, how often do you experience joy, tranquility, pride, affection, curiosity? Not all the time. And of course, the experience of negative emotions is also functional and adaptive, especially in appropriate circumstances. But then that's not really quite sufficient. So the second component of happiness is being happy with your life, basically. It's being satisfied with your life. Do you think your life is good? Are you progressing towards your life goals sort of in the way that you want? And the way I like to think about these two components of happiness is that it's being happy in your life and being happy with your life. Researchers have gone across cultures and asked people what are their most important goals in life, or how important are certain goals. And almost surprisingly, but happiness is on the top of the list for basically every culture that researchers have looked at. I mean, it's rated as kind of a generally between 6 and 7 on a 7-point scale of importance. And in terms of, and why people want, so most people want to be happy. I wrote a paper with a couple of colleagues a while ago, and there's been some follow-ups to it, showing that happiness is not just about pleasure. It's not just about something that feels good. Clearly, we want to be happy because we think we'll feel good being happy. But but also happiness is associated with a lot of success in life. So studies have shown that happiness both kind of precedes and associated with and also causes, we think, positive outcomes. So happier people make more money, for example, and they have better relationships. Now, of course, the causal direction goes both ways. So money makes people happy, but also happier people accrue more money. So, for example, studies have showed that students in college who are happier earn higher incomes at age 37. And that's controlling for parental income, so it's not just that they're wealthier to begin with and have more connections. And with relationships, there's a famous yearbook study that came out of Berkeley that showed that women who show Duchenne smiles, who are genuine smiles in their yearbook photos at age 21, are more likely to get married by age 27 and have more fulfilling marriages at age 52. So the smile in the yearbook photo is associated with happiness. The genuine smile predicts how happy they are going to be in their marriage 30 years later. Now, these are correlation and longitudinal studies. There are also experimental studies that show that when you induce people to become happier, they're more creative, they're more productive, they have, they connect better with others sort of socially. So I think there's lots of reasons to become happier. So one is that it feels good, but also I think people who are happier also, I think if you become happier, you will kind of succeed more. You'll have sort of other positive things that happen in your life. So a long time ago, some of my colleagues and I sort of developed this pie chart, and actually my colleague Ken Sheldon and I just wrote a paper that kind of is updating kind of our thinking about the pie chart. But let me sort of explain. So the question is sort of what determines happiness? And so the way I like to think about it now is that there's lots of determinants of happiness, but there's sort of three buckets. And one is genetics. I mean, there's lots of good data that there's a genetic influence on happiness. There are behavior genetic studies that show that identical twins are much more similar in their happiness levels than our fraternal twins, which suggests that identical twins, of course, share 100% of their DNA, fraternal twins 50%. So this finding suggests, so lots of findings that say this suggest that there's a genetic component to happiness. There's a study that came out that I just found out about that shows that actually was a molecular genetic study that shows that 400 places on the genome that are associated with happiness. 400. It's fascinating. Obviously, it's very complicated. So we know the genetic component to happiness doesn't mean that we're fated to kind of be happy or unhappy, based on our genes. Of course, we can sort of change our happiness. We can change our behavior. We might have to just work harder if we're unlucky enough to kind of have a lower sort of set range for happiness. So genetics is one component. And by the way, personality is tied into that because personality is also, of course, partly genetic and is very highly related to happiness. And then our life circumstances, how wealthy we are, what country we live in, how healthy we are, our relationships, are also going to affect our happiness. Generally, not as much as we think they will. That number is sort of usually smaller than we think. Of course, if your life circumstances are really bad, if you live in a war zone in Syria, if you are in an abusive relationship, if you're very poor, I mean, that's going to affect your happiness hugely. But once your basic needs are met, sort of improving your life circumstances is going to make you happier, but just sort of not hugely. And so that leaves kind of the third bucket, which is kind of how we behave in our daily life, how we think. And these are our deliberate, intentional activities or behaviors that we actually have some control over, that we have more control over than the genetics or the life circumstances. And that's what my research is focused on, is sort of how do we prompt people to try to change their behavior or their thinking on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to see if that impacts their happiness. If you just look at raw data, the least happy group is 14 to 28. So yes, so college students are right smack in the middle of the least happy group, sort of in terms of age. I have two kids in college right now. One is a freshman and one is a junior. So I'm well aware of sort of how hard it is to be a college student, and that just that age where you're trying to find your identity and your relationships, and you just sort of, there's a lot of uncertainty in life, and there's a lot of mental health issues that we see, of course, in college, those ages. So 14 to 28 is the least happy group. And basically happiness, the good news is it increases over time. Laura Carstensen at Stanford has a theory that basically shows that people become emotionally wiser as they get happier, as they age. So depending on the study, the high point in happiness might be at 65, 67, 72. I haven't seen sort of any recent data on it, but I'm sure there's lots of data. they're basically showing that people get happier as they get older. When you're very old, happiness starts to decrease. There's so many reasons that I think it's very hard to be a college student these days, and it's hard to be happy. And some of it also, there's been changes over time. I think my generation, we're like, we loved college. Well, I think it wasn't as great as maybe we remember, but it really, it really were great years, and we couldn't wait to get away from our parents. The good news is, Jean Twenge in her book iGen, which is a really great book, has shown lots of really great data that high school students these days look a lot younger, right? So 12th graders are looking more like 8th graders did in terms of how much time they spend with friends, whether they work outside of home, and also even things like driving, but also like dating, having sex, using drugs and alcohol and smoking. Some of these are good changes. Some of them are not so good, and and kids, of course, are spending a lot more time on smartphones and social media and less time face to face with people. And so that might be contributing to when they get to college, they maybe are a little bit more sheltered and have spent less time kind of like just with friends or outside the home. And it's sort of a harder transition if they are living at college. Of course, it might be different if they're living at home. And then, of course, and I've been thinking about this a lot, digital media, social media, texting is really changing social relationships. I mean, this is just one of my main interests these days. It's sort of because I'm interested in connection, and I think it's very important. Obviously, critical to happiness is to connect with other people. You can absolutely connect via texting and FaceTime and so even social media, but it's just sort of not the same. One kind of obvious argument is that human beings were hardwired to connect in person. In person when you have eye contact, when you have smell, when you have touch, when you have voice, of course, gesture, and those kinds of features are eroded sort of the more the less you have them, and sort of various features of sort of digital connection. And so that's also contributed, I think, to some difficulties that college students have. And then, of course, there's lots of stresses. There's a lot of more pressure and stress on at least sort of a segment of the student population to sort of succeed and do really well. And college is hard, anyway, so I think there's lots and lots of pressures, and there's a mental health crisis, as we know. Lots of, I think basically every college in the U.S. seems to be overwhelmed with that, and lots of factors that go into that. So I think having students learn strategies to basically to be happier, to have more positive emotion in their lives, to connect better with their friends and others, I really think it's important I think it's going to help them not only sort of feel better, but also just be more productive and to sort of be a more successful student, which I think most of them want to be. And I think connection is key to almost all the strategies that are really effective. So in my lab, I mostly study gratitude and kindness. So lots and lots of studies are showing that when you ask people to do more acts of kindness than they normally do, and also lately we've been just asking people to interact more, to act more extroverted, or to have more social interactions, and also to be more to express gratitude to people in their lives. These strategies make people happier. And we've done lots of studies with students, so students actually is a good population to generalize to. I think all three, so again, the three are gratitude, kindness, and just social interaction. They have connection, and that's the theme. When you're grateful to other people in your life, you feel more connected to them. When you help others, you feel more connected. When you just socially interact with others, you feel more connected. And so really those, to me, are the three strategies that I would focus on. One of my theories is that sort of the biggest problems that people have are personal problems, are due to too much self-focus and self-absorption. That we think too much about ourselves. It's very natural, and it's adaptive too. If we have a problem, we need to focus on ourselves. There's this great quote about, I forget, about how we're all kind of like the protagonists in our own like sordid little plays. And that's what, all day long. And that's natural. There's a self and there's consciousness. But if you're too self-absorbed and too self-focused, I think that has lots of toxic effects. And so all of these strategies that I'm talking about help take your focus off of yourself and turn your direction more towards other people. Not all the time, of course. And by the way, it could backfire if you're too focused on others and if you're sort of too giving. So all these strategies have kind of boundary conditions. But that's kind of, to me, that's my bottom line. rumination is basically like a circle. It's like it's passive, it's often, you can't help it. And it's like you're going from A to B, back to A, back to B, back to A. You're kind of going in a circle, and you're focusing on yourself and on your problems, and you're sort of, you just can't, you're dwelling without really getting any kind of insight. And it's very compelling when you're when you're sort of entangled in it. In terms of strategies, I mean, one of my favorites actually comes from, I think it's Ann Landers, like one of those like advice columnists. Someone asked her about rumination. She said, you should schedule a half hour every day to ruminate. And let's say it's from 7 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And so whenever, because it's so compelling, you just want to continue. You're like, oh, I just have to get out, figure out this problem. And so you say to yourself, every time you ruminate, oh, great, I can finish this later at 7, from 7 to 7:30 p.m. or whatever it is. And so that makes it easier to let it go at the time. Because distraction is really one of the main strategies, but it's hard to distract because you don't want to. And then once 7 p.m. comes along, often it feels kind of unnatural for you to be like, okay, now it's my rumination time, and you may not even want to do it. And if you do, fine, you kind of compartmentalize it to that. But basically, it's distraction. It's doing something else that's compelling for different people. It might be different. It could even be playing a video game, right? Obviously, so interacting with other people can really, really help. And social support can really help. One of the reasons that the theory that women are sort of ruminate too much is that there's a gender difference. Sort of they're a little bit better at kind of distracting themselves, and they'll go like play basketball with their friends, so they're not ruminating. And also, a lot of us tend to ruminate together, so we also want to make sure we don't ruminate with our friends. I mean, that's really kind of like the billion-dollar question, is how to sustain happiness. And I don't have very, very good answers about that. But because the studies so far are really showing that happiness can be improved or increased, at least temporarily. We don't have a lot of studies that show the effect lasts really, really long. I think we have a study that shows it lasts like a year maybe. But the key is that people who are able to sustain the happiness after, say, trying to be more grateful or trying to be more kind to others or try to savor positive experiences, basically they're the ones that they're continually engaging in those activities. But you mentioned hedonic adaptation. So hedonic adaptation is basically the phenomenon that human beings are just very good at getting accustomed to sort of changes in their lives. So we get a raise at work, we get a gift, we move into a nicer home, even a new relationship, we have LASIK eye surgery, that's one of my examples. And at first it's amazing, we get this boost, but then we sort of start taking it for granted. And that can happen with happiness strategies as well. Like, right, we might start, a sort of a gratitude practice, and then after a while it sort of fails to give that boost. And so what research is showing is that what you need to do is kind of vary things up, sort of, variety is the spice of happiness. And so you might express gratitude in different ways. You might express gratitude one day, savor a different day, meditate a different day. There's lots of strategies. My book, The How of Happiness, basically talks about 12 different sort of categories of strategies. I'm actually trying to update it right now. I just got permission from my publisher to update it, which is a big job. But I should say that everything in that book is accurate. It's just now there's more research to kind of back up the strategies I already talked about. And so varying the strategies is important, and and having, I don't know, any way, it's really hard to develop new habits, right? And there's a whole literature on habit formation. So how do you create habits? So on the one hand, you want to create a habit, like every time I feel angry or anxious or sad, I might try this. On the other hand, if the habit is too well developed, then you don't feel the boost anymore. So there's a little dilemma there. So it is difficult, but you have to continue putting effort into the strategies. I mean, one of my colleagues, Bob Rosenthal, I think mentioned to me a long time ago, because I often get asked this question or critiqued, like, oh, your study's only lasting for a little while. And he said, well, no one ever says this about drugs, right? Like when you stop taking the aspirin, your headache comes back, And so no one says that, oh, well, aspirin isn't effective because the headache comes back after you stop taking it. So you have to do the strategy, you have to continue doing the strategy. But how do you get people to sort of continue to kind of like, same thing with dieting, same thing with exercise, right? You have to keep exercising. You have to keep dieting. Like you can't go on a diet for 2 weeks or a month and then you're done. You're not done for the rest of your life. You diet really your whole life. overall, if you just take parents off the street, like randomly take 100 parents off the street and 100 people who are not parents, parents are going to be a little happier, and they're going to have they're going to report a lot more meaning in their life. And happiness and meaning usually goes together, but not always. And I have 4 kids, which range from ages 6 to 20, so I'm certainly aware of the challenges of parenthood. And so one answer is that it gives you sort of, parenthood often gives you sort of a lot of meaning, but not necessarily a lot of sort of positive emotion on a daily basis. Or it might give you kind of the life satisfaction part of happiness, but not the positive emotion part. Of course, you get the positive emotions. The first time your kid, says dada, or, crawls or graduates or has a success, it's like an incredible experience. And some parents say that that's worth it, right? It's like that ecstatic experience is worth all the hardship. But we have a paper that kind of summarizes, well, it asks the question, are parents happier than people who don't have kids? And the answer is it depends. It depends on the age of the kids, of course. Having a newborn, having to me, like, I think 14 months to like 2.5 is the hardest. Having kids in certain ages is going to be harder. Teenagers are harder. So it depends on a lot of factors. So I have 2 books. The first one is The How of Happiness. So The How of Happiness talks about 12 different strategies that people can use to become happy, all empirically supported, which I'm trying to update right now. And then the second is The Myths of Happiness. And that is a lot about sort of preconceptions that people have about what makes them happy or makes them unhappy. And hedonic adaptation, which is a phenomenon I mentioned where people kind of get used to things in their life, plays a big role in The Myths of Happiness.